Thank you very much, Gavina, and thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here in Montreal, this beautiful city. And without further ado, I will start talking. You see this title there. So this is my argument. First point, language is the key to the mind. If cortical structures for language are like those for other high-level skills, then if we figure out language, we also have the answer to how other high-level intellectual processing works. I claim that language has been figured out. Linguistic structure is a network of relationships, a particular kind of network that I will describe. And therefore, we can now explain various non-linguistic psychological phenomena in terms of brain structure and brain function. Okay, first the claim. Language has been figured out. Well, start with Louis Yumslev, full of elementary theory of language, and then, okay, so Lee Yumslev. He said, among other things, the postulation of objects is something different from the terms of relationships, is a superfluous axiom and consequently a metaphysical hypothesis from which linguistic science will have to be freed. In 1966, I published my outline of stratification of grammar, which demonstrated the truth of Yumslev's claim. Yumslev had made that claim, but he had never demonstrated it, so that we had to. So anyway, I had a supporting network notation system that, and I will talk a little bit about that. This makes it convincing that Yumslev was really onto something. So here's how we arrive at the relational networks. We start out thinking about morphemes and their relationships to phonemes. Well, okay, we ask, are they symbols or the objects of some kind, as linguists have always assumed, until Yumslev started saying, no, it's all relationships. So let's look at this. We have this element boy. So what is this? Well, we can plot its relations. On the one hand, we can say that it is both this represents the meaning, it has some kind of grammatical function, it has some kind of phonological representation, B, O, and Y in this sequence. Now, having done that, that symbol can disappear with no loss of information. It's a connection, not an object. Here's another way of looking at it. What do you need this for? The V just represents this, the O represents that. They're already there. So you don't need that. So we can still write it on the side, just as a label on the map. It's not part of the structure, it's on a highway map. You put Montreal next to or you put number 10 next to a road. That 10 is not to be found on the landscape at all. It's just for the map to make it easier for readers to know what you're talking about. Now let's look at these segments. What are they? Well, it turns out they are also just relations. On the one hand, they relate upward to other morphemes, and so on. And then they go down to their phonological features. And so they are also not objects. Now, what about syntax? It's also purely relational. We have variable expression. That's the difference between syntax and ordinary lexemes. So this looks a lot like that. Boy, it's got a syntactic function, it's got a meaning. The meaning of this is to do something. You have, it's just on the expression side here, but you've got variable expression. And then in syntax, these constructions link up to one another like this. You have a clause, subject, predicate. The subject is a nominal. It also has the subject of the verb. It's also a nominal expression. We can add other stuff. In addition to the verb transitive, we have the be followed by a complement, which can be either nominal or a location or adjectival. So the syntactic construction is also a linguistic sign. Its expression is variable rather than fixed, and that's how it differs from lexical signs. Therefore, the entire linguistic structure is a set of signs. The sign is a relational entity, which is a link between content and an expression. The expression is fixed for ordinary lexemes, but variable for syntactic constructions. And in similar fashion, it can be shown that all of linguistic structure is relational. It's not relationships among linguistic objects. It's relations to other relations, all the way to the top at one end and to the bottom at the other end. In that case, the whole linguistic system is a network of interconnected nodes. Now, language operates. So the information has to be represented in such a way that it can be directly used for speaking and understanding. Competence has to be competence to perform. It doesn't make sense to think of a competence model separate from a performance model. The competence model has to be competence to perform. So the information has to be in operational form. The operation of the linguistic system takes the form of activation of lines and nodes. The nodes are defined on the basis of how they treat incoming activation. So, for example, the ordered and, as we saw in boy, or verb transitive followed by its object. First A, then B, indicated by the points at which they connect at the bottom of that triangle. So we have activation. It's defined, if activation is coming down from the top, it goes first to the left line and then next to the right. And so we can define the nodes in terms of their activation, downward activation and upward activation. In this case, the and is unordered, so we get both at the same time, as you can see here. With the and, it means both incoming lines have to be activated in order to satisfy the node. When it's satisfied, it sends activation down. In this sense, in the or, only one of them has to be activated. But this is not a mistake. Although this is an or node, it goes down both lines because there's no way to know at this point which one is going to succeed. What will happen is that other things farther down will eliminate one or the other of those pathways that have been activated. And so the upward one works the same way, just reverse direction. So those are the definitions of the nodes. They're operational definitions. And when the whole system is operating, then that's how it operates to make it possible for us to speak or to understand someone who's speaking to us. Now, the upward activation through the or, as I said, it goes to both of those. Ordinarily, one or the other will be selected because of the context. So if you say, I will pay the bill tomorrow, then the context for only one will be activated, and that's the one that will get through. Or you can say, oh, I saw a duck and he had a large bill. Oh, no, that's the other kind of bill. Occasionally, you can get both of them activated, as in the pun. A duck goes into the pub and orders drinks and says, put it on my bill. You also get this phenomenon, the shadow meaning. China, Zhongguo was China, Zhongguo. But it also means to any Chinese person, Central Kingdom. So you have activation going up to all these. These are called shadow meanings, Central Kingdom. Hong Kong. Hong is fragrant, Kong is harbor, fragrant harbor. And it's called this that way because originally it was not fragrant at all. It was terrible smell. So it's relationships all the way. At the bottom we have phonetics, but there are two kinds of phonetics. For the speaker, the relational structure goes down all the way to the points at which muscles of the speech-producing mechanism are activated. At that interface, we leave the purely relational system and send activation to a different kind of physical system, namely the muscles of the speech-producing mechanism. For the hearer, the bottom is the cochlea in the inner ear, which receives activation from the sound waves. And every fiber of the cochlea is connected to a nerve ending. From that point on, it's a different kind of structure. It's all relational. Now, at the upward direction, you have meanings. And in meaning, first we have to distinguish the world outside from what is inside the mind. And in the mind, we have both perceptual and conceptual properties. So if we're talking about the meaning of dog, we have perceptual properties and conceptual properties. Conceptual, the concept dog is defined by such properties as these. We know what it looks like, that's a visual subnetwork. We know what its bark sounds like, that's an auditory subnetwork. We know what its fur feels like, a somatosensory subnetwork. So all of these constitute perceptual information. There's subnetworks with many nodes each. There's also conceptual information, and all of this is interconnected, so that the concept dog is a network. This shows only the cardinal nodes of the network. Every one of these connects to a subnetwork of properties. So for example, I'll show you that in a little more detail later. So we have perceptual structures in perceptual areas. We can distinguish between perception and conception on the basis that the perceptual structures are confined to a single perceptual modality. Conceptual structures are an integrating area that integrates information from the different perceptual modalities. Okay, now we want to get a little bit of greater precision. We have to account for the behavior of those nodes, and in doing so, you quickly realize that they have to have some kind of internal structure to account for their behavior. So the original network notation that I've been showing you so far is called the abstract notation, and we can also look at the internal structure and look at the narrow notation. So the narrow notation, every line of the abstract notation really represents two lines of narrow notation, one for each direction. And the nodes can be analyzed as pairs or more of one-way nodes. So something like this. In the abstract notation, you have, say, a construction E apple. This is the upward direction. You know, I'm not going to give you an exam on this, and you don't have to learn all the details. We have to have two directions. And the abstract notation is bidirectional. But in analyzing it, we get one for the downward direction and one for the upward direction. So this shows the internal structure of the nodes for the and for the or. The difference between and or here is shown as the difference between two different thresholds. And this is the number of incoming lines that have to be activated in order to satisfy the node. That's the threshold. And or, you only have to have one or the other. Now, another thing you can do when you get to this level of showing greater refinement, show about competition. Competition works like this. There are two possibilities here. They're both true. That means they're and nodes. They have to have the other one activated in order to satisfy the threshold. If one of them does get satisfied, then it inhibits the other one. This is what happens, say, in English between P and K, or with any other language as P and K. If you hear somebody say something with a P, tip instead of tick, you not only get the activation of the K, you also inhibit the activation of the other one. It enhances the contrast. Things like this can be shown in narrow notation. So it goes like this. Okay. Now the thresholds. The or, only one has to be satisfied to satisfy the threshold. In the end, if there are 4 incoming lines, all 4 of them have to be satisfied to make it an and. But we can also have intermediate states, like any 2 out of those 3, or any 3 out of those 4. So you can have intermediate degrees. The and or distinction was a simplification anyway. It doesn't always work, especially in semantics, where you often have multiple properties of which you usually only have a few present, and it still is enough to satisfy the node. So we started out thinking that and or was a basic distinction in language. Jacobson called it syntagmatic and paradigmatic. It's not a basic distinction after all. It's just a difference of threshold. And if we recognize thresholds, then we have a more basic structure. So and or are just special cases. What is basic is the threshold. The and, in order to satisfy activation, enters on all incoming connections, or on any one of the incoming connections. Now, we also have the ordering in the and node. First the one and then the other part. This is, in the downward direction, you can have a wait element on the second line. You have to wait a little bit before producing the second one. If this is a subject predicate, you have to wait until the subject gets completed before doing the predicate, for example. So activation continues on after that wait to B after A has been activated. On the upward side, where you're recognizing, then the wait element has to go on the other one. You have to keep this activation live so that that threshold will be activated until the second one comes in. So if you're listening, your subject predicate, subject comes in, this node is waiting for a possible predicate. So it keeps on sending that activation up there until the predicate comes in, at which point the threshold is satisfied. Now, of course, the wait element has to have its own internal structure, and this is one way to do it, to construct it. So the activation comes down here, it keeps looping around, that keeps itself alive. But you can't keep it alive forever, it has to be turned off sometime. And so at some point you turn it off. And this is a blocking element. And then it sends on, then the activation is going down. So this gets activated after the first one has been taken care of. So we have two types of connection in the narrow notation, the excitatory and the inhibitory. We just saw an example of inhibitory connection. You can also have, well, in the case of competition, you saw this type of inhibitory connection. So the two types of inhibitory, one to a node and one to a line, and you have excitatory connections. Now, all of this I want to point out is based on linguistic evidence. We haven't considered anything about neural structures yet. Another example of how you, when you want to use this type of inhibitory element is when you have irregular verbs. For example, take normal past tenses suffix, but in the case of take, you don't use that. Instead, you use this. So this one takes precedence, and so when activation comes from here, it has to block this one. You don't get take, and this one has to block this one. You don't get that suffix. Instead, you get took. So another thing we have to look at in getting our greater refinement is the two directions. You know, we have to have two directions. This is basically because people are both able to speak and to understand, right? And so this is, when you're producing something, this is speaking and this is understanding. Since the lines are directional, in narrow notation, you have to show the arrows which direction they're going. Now the question is, how, if any way, are these connected to each other? So suppose they are two lexical items. Is the downward side not connected to the upward side somehow? Well, they must be connected. The other question is, are they really next to each other like this? Maybe not. At this point, for the first time today, I'm going to bring in some evidence from neurology. We happen to know that the production side is in a different part of the cerebral cortex from the reception side. And so these down and up for phonological units, it does have to be, the down and up have to be in separate parts, but they must be connected to each other. In the cortex production, those are in the frontal lobe, these are in the temporal lobe. They have to be connected, and they are connected by fibers of the arcuate fasciculus. Okay, now we're going to look at neural networks. Relational networks were devised as a means of accounting for linguistic structure. And all these properties up to now, except for that last thing, was based solely on linguistic evidence. Back in the, way back in the 70s, when I would give lectures on this stuff, people would ask me, well, it looks a little bit like diagrams I've seen of neural structures. Is there anything, brain wiring diagrams? They would ask me, what's the relationship between this and brain? And I said, I don't have the slightest idea, because at that point I didn't know anything about the brain. But I decided I've got to learn something about the brain. And so one day I called up, I looked up in the campus directory and found the professor of neuroscience, and I called him up and said, could we have lunch? And he said, yes, sure. And so we got to have lunch. And we started asking him about neurons, how do they operate? And he started describing me and drawing pictures on paper napkins. And I said, wow, that's great, they work just the way that these stones work. So I'm going to talk about that now. Are relational networks related? Well, how can we find out? We can view the narrow network notation as a set of hypotheses about brain structure and function. So we can look at every property of the narrow relational network notation and test it for neurological plausibility. So the lines have direction, they are all one way. Nerve fibers also carry activation in just one direction. They tend to come in pairs of opposite direction, as we've seen. Cortical connections, those are connections from one part of the cortex to another. Those are also generally reciprocal. This is known from neural anatomy. Connections are either excitatory or inhibitory. Axons are either excitatory or inhibitory. They come from different kinds of neurons, two different neurotransmitters. Nodes have different thresholds of activation. Neurons have different thresholds of activation. Inhibitory connections are of two kinds. Inhibitory connections in neurons are of two kinds. Type 2, this is called axoaxonal. It blocks the activation coming down an axon in neurons. And there are a lot of additional properties. I'm going to talk about some, but all of the properties are verified. Now, we can get to further levels of precision. So we have our abstract notation, we have our narrow notation. We can have further degrees of narrowing. So, for example, you need to recognize variation in connection strength. A connection becomes stronger with repeated successful use. And stronger connections carry greater activation. And this is how we account for learning. And we can account for the gradualness of learning, connections becoming gradually stronger with repeated use. You also get, along with that, variation in thresholds. So thresholds are not fixed, as I have been depicting them up to now. They vary as a result of use and as a result of learning, and they're not integral. I've been talking about thresholds as 1, 2, 3. It doesn't work that way if you look more closely at how the language actually works. What we really need is threshold functions, such that a weak amount of incoming activation produces no response. A larger degree of activation results in weak or in weak outgoing activation, still stronger. So it's better to look at the picture here. So a weak amount of incoming activation, you get little response. In the middle range, this is input and this is output, outgoing activation. Increase in incoming activation leads to sharper increase in outgoing activation. Then you reach a limit up and above, where further increases in incoming activation will not give you much more increase in the outgoing activation. So that's this. Still higher degree of activation yields strong. So it's a sigmoid function. There it is. Okay. Connections get stronger with use. Every time the linguistic system is used, it actually changes a little bit. Every time you use a lexeme, especially this, you can notice this with unfamiliar lexemes. Every time you use it, it becomes a little bit more familiar. You can indicate this roughly in the notation by the thickness of the connecting lines, or you can write the numbers next to the lines. And there's approximations within the notation. So, what about the nodes? I've been talking about lines. The node corresponds not to a single neuron, but to a bundle of neurons. And if we turn to evidence from neuroscience, again, we can find that the appropriate bundle is the cortical column. A cortical column consists of about 70 to 100 neurons stacked on top of one another, comprising the whole thickness of the cortex. So all neurons within a column act together. When a column is activated, all its neurons are activated. So it's functioning as a unit. According to Vernon Mountcastle, who's the expert on this topic, he's been working on cortical columns for about the last 50 or 60 years. He published this monumental book in 1998, Harvard University Press. The effective unit of operation is not the single neuron and its axon, but bundles or groups of cells and their axons with similar functional properties and anatomical connections. So now we have more relational network properties for testing. These are 4 interesting properties about relational networks, and which makes them different from a lot of other networks that you see proposed in cognitive science. Nodal specificity, nodal adjacency, and then the extension of 1 and 2 to larger units, leading to cortical maps. So what do we mean by that? Nodal specificity. Every node has a specific function. I started out with, there was a node for the phonological form of boy, for example. It has a very specific function. and it turns out to be appropriate to its location. All those phonological nodes are in one part of the system, for example. Adjacency. Adjacent nodes have adjacent functions. So P and K, if they are adjacent to each other, it'll be easier for them to have their competition by the lateral inhibition, mutually inhibiting each other. Well, we get direct evidence for this from the experiments reported in Mount Cassell's book. So this is a case of experimenting that was done. I'm sorry to say that this experiment was done on a live cat, and it makes me sad what they do to these cats. I'm a fan of cats. But on the one hand, I can say, I wish they hadn't done this. But since they have, on the other hand, I'm going to use the information that they came up with. They used microelectrodes. This is the work of Hubel and Miesel and other people, which they got at Nobel Prize. Used microelectrodes so small that they could detect activation in a single neuron. And they sent these microelectrodes down from the top of the cortex. This is the cortex of the cat, the part of the cortex that recognizes when things are happening to the cat's bone. And the neurons are stacked in columns, and so that as the microelectrode went down from one to the next, it gradually, as it activated, it picked up activation one at a time. As long as you were stimulating this part of the cat's paw. Each of those, this represents the diagram of a particular neuron of those neurons. And every one of them responds to stimulation at exactly the same point in the cat's paw. This is nodal specificity. The node, the column, in other words, represents that particular position on the cat's paw. It's very specific to just that position. That's what I mean by nodal specificity. Adjacency means that adjacent locations for adjacent functions. And in some cases, when they were sticking this microelectrode down, it would slip over into the next column. Very easy to do that because one column is only 50 microns in diameter. It's very easy for it to slip over to the joint column. When it did, it picked up activation from the adjacent location of the cat's paw. So you have adjacent functions represented by adjacent locations in the cortical network. This is very important. Here's a similar finding from visual, for the visual system. In this case, you have a part of the visual cortex in which orientation of lines, line segments. So here, this represents the orientation as a line segment like this. And the microelectrode is encountering each neuron in the column, and each one responds to the line segment of the same orientation. But if you go through, send it sideways so that at each level you hit a different column, then you have a different line orientation. And it's actually nicely organized, adjacent columns or adjacent line orientations. Here's another case of, in a cat's cortex, the auditory areas, the coccygeal position is related to the positions of the columns in the cortex. So in every case, we have nodal specificity. Every node has a specific function and nodal adjacency. Adjacent functions, adjacent locations in the network. Now, consequences. This being the case, then clusters of nodes with similar function would be would really be clustered because they'll be in roughly the same location, adjacent to one another. And this makes it very easy to account for competition because the competing nodes are competing. Why? Because they're very similar in function. And so it's very easy to implement that competition, which requires that you have mutual inhibitory connections. It's very easy because they're adjacent to each other. So these properties of the linguistic structure are also directly verified in the neurological information, in the neurological evidence. Now, it also applies at very much larger levels. As if you have this general principle that clusters of nodes with similar functions, you can think about still larger levels and still more general functions. And so this is, we have an example of this in the visual area of a temporal lobe top monkey. These are quite large columns of maybe hundreds of nodes each. And you notice, here's an example of adjacency function. You have this. See, all three of these share that there's this kind of ovoid shape. Here's a kind of a, this is circular and elliptical, and on the other kind of elliptical on the other kind. Here is this different shading. So they all share something, and yet they also differ within this, and not shown here, but if you further subdivide this, you get further differences. So here's a nice one. There's another monkey face. And just different orientations of the face. So you're getting both, this is at the very large level, we're talking about hundreds of adjacent mini columns, where you still have specificity of function and adjacency of function. Adjacent locations for adjacent functions. So this applies throughout at the large scale as well as the small scale. And it means that, in a sense, the cortex, not only do we have our little homunculus in the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex, where throughout you have the body, all the different neighboring locations of the body represented by neighboring locations in the cortex. This is kind of a map of the body, in other words, in there. What we're seeing is that this principle probably applies throughout the whole cortex, so that up in the conceptual areas, you're getting actual conceptual maps in the cortex. So we have these columns of different sizes, as illustrated in that last slide. We can call the largest one a hypercolumn, and we get a subcategory with what can be called a maxi-column, and it gets further subdivided because of additional features, so you get additional specifications. So at the larger scale, when we talk about adjacency, adjacency of function for adjacency of location in the cortex, what this means is that, in general, closely related cortical functions will tend to be in adjacent areas. So Broca's area ought to be close to the primary motor cortex. In fact, it should be close to the mouth area of the primary cortex, and that's exactly where it is. Wernicke's area should be close to the primary auditory area, and sure enough, there it is. The angular gyrus ought to be close to Wernicke's area, because this is where lexical and conceptual information is related to those phonological units. And sure enough, it is. Brodmann's area 37 also needs to be close to Wernicke's area, and sure enough, it is. Another part of the proximity principle is that a function that is intermediate between two other functions tends to be intermediate location. So Wernicke's area is intermediate between the primary auditory gyrus, primary auditory area and the angular gyrus. Competition. I've already said adjacent columns will usually be in competition with one another. Why is that? Because we already see from the adjacency principle that they are going to have similar functions. And since they have similar functions, they differ with respect to just one property or two properties while sharing other properties. So they're in competition. So we can predict that similar things are going to be in competition. And so in phonology, you have voiceless stops of the same position, of different position. In vision, line segments of similar but differing orientation, similar but distinct colors. As a consequence of competition, columns of any size, the same thing will apply at larger levels, should have reciprocal inhibitory connections with neighboring columns. And this is a well-established fact from neuroanatomy. As Mountcastle says, columnar specificity is maintained by pericolumnar inhibition. Inhibitory cells can also inhibit other inhibitory cells. Okay, we don't need to. So here's a model of the mini column. This is a very simplified model. The column actually has maybe up to 110 neurons stacked on top of each other. This is inhibitory node sends inhibitory activation to neighboring columns. So the connections from a particular column, there are long distance connections going through the white matter. These are myelinated axons of pyramidal neurons. And then there are the horizontal connections, both excitatory and inhibitory. Another picture, lateral inhibition. These nodes are similar but different, like PTK, for example. Whenever any one of them gets activated, it inhibits its competitors. That enhances the contrast. We can show this in narrow notation in this way that I showed you earlier. A little bit about quantities of the columns. The diameter of a mini column is about 30 microns. Micron is a millionth of a meter, a thousandth of a millimeter. That means per mini column, per mini column you get 70 to 110, average 75 to 80. That means that since they are 30 microns, you under 1 square millimeter of cortical surface, you get average of about 1,460 columns, mini columns. We call them these mini columns because you also have the larger ones, the bundles of columns. Per square centimeter, you get 100 times that much, 146,000 columns. Using those figures, you can calculate how many columns are present in, for example, Wernicke's area. You can calculate the size of Wernicke's area at approximately 20 square centimeters, multiplied by the number of columns per square centimeter, and you get close to 3 million cortical columns in Wernicke's area. Now, what you have to do is to be able to, in that area, you have to be able to represent all of the syllables and larger and smaller phonological units that a person is likely to be able to learn in his lifetime. And it comes out just about right. This is more than most people ever use, but that's the way the brains work. We have much more capacity than most people ever use, much more. So it figures that there's another kind of supporting evidence. Now let's look a little more. Here's the concept of dog as a network. I talked about it earlier. You have all these different properties that go together to make up the meaning of it. Each one of these is just a high-level local node with a particular function. This is the visual representation of the dog, but it doesn't do that all by itself. It's because it's connected to a large subnetwork of properties. So, for example, if you zoom in on that one, you have this, and it's a much larger network than shown here. Now, remember, because of nodal specificity, every one of these nodes has a specific local function. Every one of them is a particular visual feature, which goes up to make up the whole visual recognition of the dog. And there's much more that's shown here. It takes, I came across one estimate that there are about 70 different layers of integration in visual perception. And so every one of them has a specific function. As you get higher, their functions cover more territory, as it were, until you get at a very high level, where you have this. This also has a specific function. It's the visual representation of a typical dog. But it doesn't do that all by itself. Every node is a very simple operation. It has very simple operation in its own. It represents dog because it's supported by that whole network. It's like the executive of a corporation. He doesn't do everything that the corporation does. Those things are done by all the people that work at the corporation. So the guy's a CEO of a company that makes paper clips. He doesn't make any paper clips himself. He's just, so that's the way this is. So I'm not going to talk about fork instead of dog because we know a little bit more when we think about where these particular nodes are located in the case of the fork, namely like this. And here's the same thing with, I've shown the subnet supporting the V here, part of it, and also for the phonological production, again, just part of it. At the top of the whole thing is the cardinal concept. So let's put this into operation. This is a word network. And you see a fork. This is what's going to happen. What happens when you see a fork? Well, okay. Here's what happens. Yeah, as soon as you get this one, you see the concept node is connected to all these others, so it sends out parallel activation to all those. Phonological recognition would be appointed in Brennigan's area. You go across the articulate for sequence here to the articulation. So, stop looking. I don't know. You got another one. Like maybe my battery went down there. So I can use this. Oh, I was wondering. Oh, use this.
I guess that works. It's not very convenient.
You won't see what's supposed to be happening.
Would you go with this out?
Oh, I can use that then. Okay.
If you could, yeah. Probably something was nice.
Can you
Try to do that.
Okay, I can use. Let's see. Where's my
Troubles with the mouse too.
Si la souris ne répond pas, ça peut se faire comme si PowerPoint était gelé. Peut juste repartir.
Ouais, mais ça marche avec.
S'il ne répond plus à deux sortes d'inputs,
Il répond en
à
flèche encore. We'll try it. Can I jump to the next?
Yes, sure. I can tell you what's, if I just showed you that little scenario, that's what we would predict. And then we have some very nice evidence coming up in the next slide from an MEG experiment that was done a few years ago by people at the Max Planck Institute of Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, Netherlands. The experiment was actually done in Helsinki. At that time, Helsinki had an MEG machine, they didn't yet have one in Nijmegen. And they showed pictures of animals to the subjects. And the subject was said, we're going to show you a picture of an animal, and we want you to say what the animal is. And pay attention, say as fast as possible. And MEG, as you probably know, has the ability to show the time course of activation because it picks up signals, magnetic signals from brain activity instantaneously. Unlike fMRI, which you get the response in terms of increased cerebral blood flow only several seconds after the increase in cortical activity. With MEG, you get it immediately. This makes it possible to plot the time course of activation. And so we see in these diagrams the time course of activation after they see the picture of the animal. And starts over here. This is the occipital lobe. And that's where the input from the eyes comes. That's where the visual cortex is. So this was being activated. This was getting most activation during the first 150 milliseconds. And then during the period from 150 to 275, the greatest activation is shown here. This is left hemisphere, this is right hemisphere. And you see it, both hemispheres are activated. This is where you're getting mostly conceptual information. And then from 275 to 400 milliseconds, So this is really beautiful. Here is Vernick's area. Once you get the concept, then you get the phonological image of the animal's name. Once you recognize it's a horse, here's the visual of a horse. Here's the concept horse. Here's what horse sounds like as a phonological unit. And over here, there's approximately the Broca's area. You're getting ready to say the word. Well, now, of course, there are always multiple things going on in the cortex at the same time, so you also see other things being activated. But this is a really nice support for that little thing that I just showed you.
Okay, try the last one.
And by the way, it takes, you see the person, after 600 milliseconds, the sound horse finally comes out of the person's mouth. It takes 600 milliseconds, 6 cents of a second. Neuron to neuron activity may be 5 milliseconds, but so you can see there's an awful lot of neural processing that's involved. Just recognizing the picture and saying what it is you just saw. It seems instantaneous to us, but in fact, it's because most of the great preponderance of our mental processing is subconscious.
I don't think it has to be full screen.
I could go on. So anyway, so we find that all of these properties of relational networks that were arrived at by studying linguistic structure turn out to be verified from neuroscience. So this gives us a lot of confidence that with relational networks we're really onto something. Okay. So that brings us to the third part of my presentation, which is, if it is the case that linguistic structure makes use of the same general cortical structures as other intelligent processes, then we should be able to say that what we've learned from studying language in relation to the brain can be applied to studying how the brain works in general, how other things work. And so I've taken a few psychological experiments, and which are, I think, rather interesting, and I've shown how we can account for them in terms of brain structure and function. The first one is a couple of studies that were done by Barg and his associates, John Barg, who was at NYU at the time. He's now at Yale University. And this was an experiment in which he took a bunch of students. You know, these psychological experiments always use students in psychology courses. So he took these students, they were brought up to the lab, and he said, now this is an experiment in which you're going to, we're measuring, we're not measuring, we are studying linguistic operations. And what they did was they gave them there was a scrambled sentence test, they call it, 5 words, and the student, the subject, had to make a sentence using 4 out of those 5 words. And, can we,
I'm not sure.
oh, okay. Using 4 out of the 5 words. Now, there were 2 sets of words, and they differed in this respect. There was one for the experimental group, the other for the control group. For the experimental group, 1 word out of each of the 5, 1 word in each set of 5 words, only 1 word in each set, was related to aging in some way. So there were words like retirement, or retire, Florida, shuffleboard, things related to aging. Okay. And in the control group, they were just neutral words. And then when the experiment was finished, the experimenter told the elevators down the hall, and sitting outside the office was a graduate student who was a collaborator of the experimenter, but he appeared to be just somebody waiting to talk to the professor. And he had a stopwatch, and he measured the amount of time it took the student to walk down to the elevator. It's a distance of 9.75 meters down the hall to the elevator. And the people who had been primed with these words related to aging walked more slowly. That was the result. No,
I don't know where you are in the
no, we
presentation.
have to go, yeah, I'm about 2/3 of it was working.
Yes.
Okay, can we go,
I don't know where you are now.
can we get onto the, I'm way down about 100 supplies. Oh, you can do this, okay, yeah. Good. Get me down to, I passed all that ignition, right down here. Okay, yeah.
Where?
110.
Here's the thing.
Unconscious?
Yeah, let's go. Let's go. Okay, good, great. So here are examples of these five words. Each set of 5 words that you're supposed to, you make a sentence out of this. Well, they will be lonely. Could be caught. But and the elderly primary condition had these words. These are the words related to aging. So here are these words that were used in the experimental group, and there's one word of each that's related to aging, but not very strongly, just a little bit. And this is so the 9.75 meters. This is the people who hit the experimental group. This is the control group. Very significant difference. They were so surprised at this, they said, we better try it again and replicate, see if we can replicate it. And they did, and they got the same result. Now, I must say that there have been other experimenters who have read this literature, this paper when it came out. It made quite a sensation. Other people tried to replicate it and failed to get the same result. And so they criticized Mark. Well, we didn't get this result. And Mark said, well, you didn't follow the procedure properly. So it's been controversial. But here's another experiment in which they took words associated with the concept rude, another group words associated with the concept polite, and the third group had neutral words, just like these. So here they are. Now, neither the experimenter nor the confederate knew which priming condition was being used with each subject. After finishing, the subject was told to go and see the experimenter in another room down the hall. Now, the experimenter was talking with another person, a confederate. The confederate was posing as a student who was having trouble understanding directions. So he kept asking directions of the experimenter. And so the subject of the experiment was supposed to go down there, and he was supposed to, but he was waiting for them to finish. But they kept on talking until he finally got fed up and interrupted them. So the question is, how long did it take? They had a 10-minute limit. If they didn't interrupt after 10 minutes, then they was over. And none of the subjects showed any suspicion of influence of the scrambled sentence test. Okay, and okay, so this is the results. When the rude priming condition, 326 seconds, this is the time until they interrupted. Neutral condition, polite priming condition, 558 seconds, almost 10 minutes. And 21 of the 34 did not interrupt at all during the entire 10-minute period. They had been primed with politeness. This is how it shows right there. So a clear influence of language on behavior, and the influence is unconscious. How does it work? Okay, now in terms of brain structure, well, first we have the bidirectional connections. They're required for linguistic structure, and it's verified by neuroanatomy. And since you have this, you have reverberating activation, because when a node gets activated, it sends out activation. So once you get activation going, it will tend to reverberate, and that increases the activation levels. Okay, there's that. We've already seen this. So bidirectional processing, yeah, okay, we've seen this. Okay. Now, consequences of repeated activation, the links become stronger, is a lasting effect, and as a short-term effect, the nodes become more highly activated. When more activated, they send out stronger activation. And so in the case of the words relating to old, you have this reverberating activation, which is strengthening the activation during the time. It doesn't take much, apparently, and it's unconscious. But all of these, especially old, are related to slow. which, by the way, was not one of the words used in the experiment at all. But it got activated, and it not only got activated, but it caused slowness in behavior. Now, to appreciate that, we have to understand the functional layout of the gray matter. We know, visual is not septal lobe, the motor is in the frontal lobe, and that the secondary areas and associated areas are adjacent to the primary, associated secondary areas adjacent to primary areas, and so on. Then the executive area and the prefrontal lobe. So in the primary motor and somatosensory area, here's where you have this little map of the body. These are the elementary actions close to the sulcus here. And then adjacent to them, this is the map of the body. Notice how you have this adjacency of function. And adjacent to the elementary actions are higher level actions performed by the hand. Actions performed by the leg. Actions performed by the mouth. Such as speaking. So you have a simple action just like moving your finger, but picking up an object with your hand is a complex action because it requires all your fingers and moving the arm as well, and moving them in coordination. This is fairly, and so by the proximity principle and the adjacent, which comes from the adjacency function, you figure those kind of more complex actions are a little more interior until you get to more and more complex actions, more and more interior. And so actually the meanings of verbs pertaining to actions by any part of the body have to be in this part of the cortex. As verbal concepts, just as nouns are in this part of the cortex. So verbal concepts, they include things like programs for performing activity represented as network structures. Secondary, you get network structures in the posterior cortex. So you also are able to recognize when somebody else is doing something. Okay, activation spreads automatically among related concepts because they are interconnected. So this is the concepts associated with rudeness. As these concepts are all activity related, they are all presumably located in the frontal and prefrontal lobes. In the experiment, they were triggered by visual linguistic input, that is, the words pertaining to rudeness, or politeness, as the case may be. In this case, it's the rudeness words. And so this strengthened that part of the prefrontal lobe, which is associated with rude behavior. And so you were much more likely to interrupt. Another interesting example, in 1997, I'm almost through by the way, the first Mars rover landed on Mars. So as a result of that, sales of Mars rover toys increased dramatically, of course, no surprise. What may be a little surprising is that the sales of Mars candy bars. Mars candy bars, they're just called Mars bars because they're named for the person who founded the company, Franklin Mars. But that linguistic element Mars, it activates Mars and then the last experiment is a paper that is just now being published. They took 56 smokers, they watched a short television segment that included a commercial break showing a public service announcement. These are 56 people, all smokers. They were randomly placed in one of three groups according to the type of public service announcement they saw. The tobacco companies in the United States are required to show these so-called quit assist commercials, telling them about the dangers of smoking, so that they will be encouraged to quit smoking. Okay. Then there are other similar anti-smoking things, but produced by a non-profit organization. And then the third watch, control, is that it didn't have anything to do with smoking at all. And then the subjects, after the TV viewing, they were given a break. They were left alone. They had the option of going out for a smoke. Now, so how many people went out for a smoke? Group 1, Philip Morris quit as this group, okay. The control group, 11%. From the anti-smoking PSA, from the non-profit organization, 33. They were watching a commercial talking about the dangers of smoking. But it used words related to smoking. Those words were priming the activities in the prefrontal cortex, which are associated with smoking. So they were, and the Philip Morris. Now, these guys knew what they were doing. This is a tobacco company producing an anti-smoking. This is the graph of those results. That's it.